There's a photograph from 1963 that tells a different story than the one people remember. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward are sitting at a restaurant table in New York. To the casual observer, they look like the perfect Hollywood couple. Beautiful, successful, in love. Paul's hand rests near hers. They're both smiling for the camera. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice they're not looking at each other. Their eyes are facing the same direction, but there's distance in their gaze, a careful space between their bodies, the kind of distance that speaks louder than touch ever could. This was taken during what Paul would later call the worst year of our marriage, a year when the fairy tale everyone believed in almost shattered, when the man America saw as the devoted husband, the rare Hollywood success story, came dangerously close to destroying everything he'd built. For decades, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were held up as proof that true love could survive Hollywood. 50 years of marriage, a partnership built on respect, loyalty, and genuine affection. The couple that made it when everyone else failed. But what the public never knew, what even their closest friends barely understood, was that there was a moment in the early years when it almost didn't survive, when Paul's demons, his drinking, his guilt over his first marriage, and his inability to forgive himself nearly cost him the one person who'd truly seen him. This isn't the story of a perfect marriage. It's the story of two people who fought like hell to save something worth saving, even when it would have been easier to walk away. If you watched movies in the 1960s and 70s, Paul Newman was everything Hollywood was supposed to be. Those blue eyes, impossibly blue, the kind that made the camera operators joke they had to adjust for the color, that crooked smile, that effortless charisma that made him a leading man, but also kept him grounded, real, accessible. He wasn't pretty boy handsome like Rock Hudson or tough guy handsome like Clint Eastwood. He was something in between, masculine but vulnerable, confident but self-deprecating, a movie star who somehow never seemed like he took himself too seriously. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, The Hustler, Cool Hand Luke, Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Verdict. He played anti-heroes, rebels, men who questioned authority and lived by their own codes. But underneath the characters, there was always something decent, something fundamentally good. And then there was Joanne. Joanne Woodward was his equal in every way. A serious actress, Academy Award winner for The Three Faces of Eve in 1957, talented enough to hold her own opposite anyone. She was smart, funny, grounded. She didn't need Hollywood's approval. She had substance. They met in 1953, both struggling actors trying to make it in New York. Paul was married to his first wife, Jackie Whitty, with whom he had 3 children, Scott, Susan, and Stephanie. But the marriage was falling apart. Paul fell for Joanne almost immediately. She was different. She challenged him intellectually. She didn't worship him or need him to be anything other than himself. They married in 1958, shortly after Paul's divorce was finalized. They had 3 daughters together, Eleanor, called Nell, Melissa, called Lissy, and Claire, called Clea. And for the next 50 years, they became the couple everyone pointed to when they wanted to believe that Hollywood marriages could last. Paul famously said, "Why go out for a hamburger when you have steak at home?" It became one of the most quoted lines about fidelity in Hollywood history. But what people didn't know was that there were years, long, difficult years, when even steak wasn't enough to fill the emptiness Paul felt inside. The trouble started before they even got married. Paul carried guilt about his first marriage like a stone in his chest. He'd married Jackie young, too young, he later admitted. He was in the Navy, she was pretty, and it seemed like the thing to do. They had 3 kids quickly. Paul was trying to build an acting career, but it wasn't going well. Money was tight. He was frustrated, distant, drinking more than he should. And then he met Joanne. He didn't mean to fall in love with her. He tried to resist it, but the connection was undeniable. Joanne saw him, really saw him, in a way Jackie never had. When Paul finally asked Jackie for a divorce in 1957, it was devastating. For her, for the kids. Jackie felt betrayed, abandoned. The children, especially Scott, the oldest, were confused and hurt. Paul knew he'd caused that pain, knew he'd broken his family, and that guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. He married Joanne in January 1958 in Las Vegas. It should have been a happy beginning. They were in love. They had talent. They had opportunities. But Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he'd committed an unforgivable sin. He started drinking more. Beer at first, then bourbon. Not enough to be called an alcoholic. Not yet, but enough that Joanne noticed. And then there was the career imbalance. When they married, Joanne was the bigger star. She'd just won an Oscar. Paul was still fighting for recognition, still auditioning, still trying to prove himself. By 1961, that had shifted. Paul's career exploded. The Hustler made him a serious actor. HUD solidified his status. Suddenly, he was the star, and Joanne was Paul Newman's wife. She never said it bothered her. She was proud of him. But Hollywood is a brutal place for women, especially mothers who take time off to raise children. Joanne wanted to act, but she also wanted to be present for their daughters. Paul was gone constantly, filming on location, doing press, building his career. The balance was impossible. And then, in the early 1960s, the cracks started showing. Paul was drinking heavily after long days on set. He was moody, distant, battling demons he couldn't articulate. The guilt over his first marriage, the pressure to stay on top, the fear that he wasn't good enough as a husband, as a father, as a man. Joanne tried to reach him, tried to talk to him, tried to pull him back from whatever edge he was standing on, but Paul kept pulling away. There were arguments, nights when he didn't come home until dawn, mornings when Joanne woke up alone and wondered if this was the marriage she'd signed up for. Friends started noticing. Paul wasn't philandering. He never cheated on Joanne by all accounts, but he was disappearing into himself, into bottles, into work, into anything that kept him from sitting still and facing what was really wrong. By 1963, Joanne had reached a breaking point. She told him, "I can't do this anymore. Not like this. Either you figure out what's wrong, or I'm leaving." It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. And Paul, for the first time, realized he was about to lose the best thing that had ever happened to him. By 1960, Paul Newman was one of the biggest stars in the world. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was a massive hit. Funny, stylish, effortlessly cool. His chemistry with Robert Redford was legendary. The film made over $100 million, an enormous sum at the time. He followed it with The Sting in 1973, reuniting with Redford for another box office smash. 7 Academy Award wins, including Best Picture. Paul was rich, famous, respected. He commanded top dollar for every film. He had power, influence, creative control. But more importantly, by the early 1970s, he'd gotten sober. Not through rehab or a dramatic intervention. Paul never hit rock bottom in the traditional sense, but he recognized that alcohol was becoming a problem, not destroying his life yet, but eroding it slowly, like water on stone. So he quit, cold turkey, just decided one day that he was done and never looked back. It wasn't easy. The demons didn't disappear just because the drinking stopped, but it was a choice he made to save his marriage, to save himself. Joanne stayed. She could have left, should have left, by Hollywood standards, but she believed in him, believed in them, and slowly things got better. Paul started racing cars, not as a hobby, but seriously. He competed professionally, won races, found something that gave him the adrenaline rush he'd been chasing in bottles. It was dangerous, but it was controlled, focused, something he could master. He and Joanne worked together when they could. He directed her in films like Rachel in 1968, which earned her an Oscar nomination. They created space for both their careers, found rhythms that worked. They built a life in Connecticut, far from Hollywood, a farmhouse where they raised their daughters, where they could garden and cook and live like normal people when they weren't working. Paul started Newman's Own in 1982, a food company where all profits went to charity. It became enormously successful, eventually donating over $500 million to charitable causes. He was nominated for Academy Awards 9 times before finally winning for The Color of Money in 1986. He accepted the award with his trademark humility, joking that he'd been hoping to win on sympathy. By the 1980s, Paul and Joanne were living proof that Hollywood marriages could work. 50 years together, 3 daughters, 6 grandchildren, a partnership that had weathered storms and come out stronger. But the scars never fully disappeared. Paul's relationship with his children from his first marriage remained complicated. His son, Scott, struggled with addiction and anger. He resented his father's absence, the divorce, the new family that seemed to replace the old one. In 1978, Scott Newman died of a drug and alcohol overdose. He was 28 years old. Paul was devastated. The guilt he'd carried about the divorce, about not being there enough, about choosing his career and his new marriage over his first family, it all came crashing back. He established the Scott Newman Center in his son's memory, dedicated to preventing drug abuse. He threw himself into the work, but friends said he never fully recovered from Scott's death. It reinforced what he'd always feared, that his choices had consequences, that leaving his first marriage, no matter how necessary it had felt, had caused irreparable damage. Joanne held him through it, but the grief created another layer of distance between them, not the dangerous kind from the early years, but the kind that comes from carrying pain that can't fully be shared. Paul also struggled with his relationship with his daughters from his second marriage. He loved them fiercely, but he was often gone, working, racing, building empires. He tried to be present, tried to be better than he'd been with his first family, but the pattern was hard to break. Nell, Lissy, and Clea later said their father was loving but complicated, present but distant, trying but not always succeeding. And Joanne, brilliant, talented Joanne, gave up much of her career to make the marriage work. She acted less, directed occasionally, focused on raising their daughters. She never publicly complained, but those who knew her said there were moments of frustration, moments when she wondered what her career might have been if she'd made different choices. But she chose Paul, chose their marriage, chose to believe that partnership was worth the sacrifice. And most days, it was. It was late at night in 1977, at their home in Connecticut. The kids were asleep. The house was quiet. Paul sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He couldn't sleep, hadn't been able to sleep well for weeks. Joanne came downstairs, wrapped in a bathrobe, and sat across from him. "You want to talk about it?" she asked. Paul shook his head, then, after a long silence, changed his mind. "I think about Scott every day," he said quietly. "I wonder if things would be different if I'd been better." "You did the best you could," Joanne said. "It wasn't enough. It never feels like enough. That's what being a parent is." Paul looked at her, this woman who'd stuck with him through the drinking, the distance, the years when he was barely present, this woman who'd given up pieces of her own dreams to hold their family together. "I don't know why you stayed," he said. Joanne smiled, that same smile that had first caught his attention 24 years earlier. "Because I love you, even when you're impossible, even when you're running from yourself, even when you make it really, really hard." Paul reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry for all of it, for the drinking, for the distance, for not always being what you needed." "You're here now," Joanne said. "That's what matters." They sat there in the quiet kitchen, holding hands, two people who'd chosen each other over and over again, even when it would have been easier to quit. And in that moment, Paul understood something he'd been too scared to believe for years that he was worthy of being loved, not because he was perfect, but because he kept trying, because he'd stopped running, because he'd let someone see all of him, the good, the broken, the guilty, the scared, and she'd stayed anyway. The turning point didn't come all at once. It came in small moments over many years. In therapy sessions, Paul finally agreed to attend. In conversations, he finally stopped avoiding. In the decision to stop drinking. In the choice to be present, even when it was uncomfortable. It came when he stopped trying to be the perfect husband and accepted that being an honest one was enough. By the 1980s and 90s, Paul and Joanne had found a rhythm. They worked together when it made sense. They gave each other space when it didn't. They traveled. They spent time with their grandchildren. They grew old together in a way that felt earned rather than automatic. In 2006, Paul announced his retirement from acting at age 83. His last major role was in Road to Perdition in 2002, playing an aging Irish mob boss with a quiet dignity that earned him yet another Oscar nomination. He spent his final years in Connecticut with Joanne, surrounded by family, working on Newman's Own, racing occasionally, living the quiet life he'd always wanted, but had taken decades to feel worthy of. In September 2008, Paul Newman died at home after a battle with lung cancer. He was 83 years old. Joanne was by his side. So were their daughters. He died the way he'd lived the second half of his life, surrounded by people who loved him, in the home he'd built with the woman who'd never given up on him. Here's what most people never understood about Paul Newman. The perfect marriage wasn't perfect. It was work, hard, daily, exhausting work. The work of showing up, even when you don't want to. The work of being honest, even when it's terrifying. The work of forgiving yourself so you can let someone else love you. Paul wasn't a saint. He was a man who made mistakes, who hurt people, who struggled with demons that had nothing to do with Hollywood and everything to do with the guilt and fear he carried from childhood. But he was also a man who chose every single day to try to be better. He chose to stop drinking. He chose to go to therapy. He chose to stay in his marriage when it would have been easier to leave. He chose to face his guilt instead of running from it. And Joanne, strong, brilliant, patient Joanne, chose him over and over. Not because he was perfect, but because beneath all the brokenness, there was something worth fighting for. The real legacy of Paul Newman isn't the movies or the Oscars or even Newman's Own. It's the marriage, the 50 years with one person, the proof that Hollywood endings are possible if you're willing to do the work. Not the fairy tale kind of work where everything is easy and love conquers all, but the real kind, the kind where you screw up and apologize, where you hurt each other and heal, where you build something together, brick by brick, day by day, until one day you look around and realize you've created something beautiful. They held Paul Newman's memorial service in November 2008 in Connecticut. It was private, just family and close friends. No media circus, no Hollywood spectacle. Just people who'd known the man behind the legend gathering to say goodbye. Joanne was there, grief-stricken, but composed. She didn't speak publicly, didn't need to. After 50 years, she'd said everything that needed saying. Their daughters spoke. They talked about a father who tried, who wasn't always present but always loved them, who made mistakes but never stopped working to be better. Robert Redford spoke. So did Tom Cruise, who'd worked with Paul on The Color of Money. They talked about his talent, his generosity, his refusal to take himself too seriously despite being one of the greatest actors of his generation. But mostly, they talked about Joanne, about the partnership, about the marriage that shouldn't have worked by Hollywood standards, but lasted longer than most people's entire careers, about the woman who saw past the blue eyes and the charm and the fame to the broken boy underneath and loved him anyway. They buried Paul at a private location in Connecticut, near the home he'd shared with Joanne for decades. In the years since, Joanne has lived quietly. She developed Alzheimer's disease, spending her final years in the home they built together, cared for by her daughters. The legacy they left isn't just in films or charities or racing trophies. It's in the example they set. That marriage isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. That love isn't about never fighting. It's about choosing to stay even when things get hard. That the real heroism isn't in the grand gestures Hollywood celebrates. It's in the small daily choice to show up, to be honest, to do the work. Paul Newman once said, "I'm a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the more I have of it." He could have said the same about marriage. Some stories aren't about the fairy tale. They're about the fight to make something real last. And some stories stay with us forever. If this quiet story touched you, feel free to subscribe and join us for more forgotten American lives.